presentation. And next, we're going to have, is it Mr. Donahue and Ben Manel?
Ben is here, but I'll be giving the presentation. You're going to have a long presentation with Ben next month that I'm going to describe briefly here as he talks about that while I'm out.
How lucky. There, I thought I saw you back there, Ben. Okay, on the 81 corridor, which I know is very important to this district.
Thanks, Madam Chair, members of the board. I'm here to update you today about the Interstate 81 Corridor Improvement Plan, and just kind of, again, an overview of Interstate 81, and this is a result of legislation that was sponsored by Senator Obenshain and Senator Carrico. It passed the Senate, I believe, unanimously, and passed the House with 3 or 4 no votes, so pretty broad swath of bipartisan and geographic support in the Assembly.
I also just add that Delegate Steve Landis also put the language in the House budget.
Again, just a quick overview of why we're looking at this corridor. This is the longest interstate corridor in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's 325 miles long. It carries 42% of our interstate truck traffic, and has a lot of incidences that take a long time to clear and result in multiple lane closures and a lack of resiliency in that corridor where people get stuck for a number of hours sitting waiting for incidents to be cleared. The other thing about 81 is it has some very significant terrain issues that we don't typically see in our other major corridors like 95, 66, and 64. And that combined with the truck traffic is particularly important because trucks, a typical truck driving on flat terrain takes up about the space of 2 passenger vehicles. But when you see really steep terrain, those trucks can start to take up as much space as 5 passenger vehicles. And so when you look at traffic counts on 81, they don't actually show you the kind of true impact of what using that facility is like when you could take into account the size of those trucks along with the grade that you're experiencing. So this slide here really shows you, the blue line is the average traffic that you see in 81 at key points all along that corridor. The orange bar is the passenger car equivalent, and that means we've looked at the truck traffic as well as the grade of I-81 in this area and recognized
That was me.
When you see a 3% grade, that truck's actually taking up the space of 5 cars. And so it actually is creating, safety, congestion, and other types of issues along this corridor. And so if you look at Christiansburg, right at Christiansburg Mountain, the average annual daily traffic is somewhere around 46,000. But if you take into account the grade and the number of trucks, we're over 70,000 passenger car equivalents on there, which is almost a 50% increase. And again, that's due to the high number of trucks in that area, and the grades are, I believe, at 3 or 4% on that particular mountain there. And so it's just a very challenging corridor because of the grades and the types of vehicles we see using it. I really wanted to talk today about the plan that VDOT and the Office of Intermodal Planning have put together to move forward with this study. We have a very, very tight time frame. We are supposed to provide to the General Assembly a executive report by the first day of session, and we're supposed to finish all meetings on this matter by the end of November this year. So that means between now and basically the last meeting of this year, which will probably be in early December, this body needs to complete its actions with regard to this study. And the legislation really has 2 key components that you as the board are supposed to examine. The first is looking at funding and financing options for the 81 corridor. And I do want to note the legislation is not restrictive in general with regard to what can be considered. It does explicitly, though, require the board to consider truck-only tolls throughout the corridor, and also consider whether there are areas in some of the urban parts of the corridor where high occupancy toll lanes, similar to what we've seen on 66, 95, and 64 down in Hampton Roads, might be applicable. It does prohibit exploring tolling all vehicles. So I know Mr. Williams remembers the Star Solution proposal from years ago where there was the concept to add 2 lanes in each direction on I-81 and toll all vehicles using that facility. It was made very clear to us by the legislature that that is not the type of concept that they want us coming back with. We may also, if we choose, consider things like a regional fuels tax or other type of funding and financing options. Again, there is flexibility on some of those items there. And again, this is really to help us get a sense of what type of package of improvements could be delivered to understand, are we talking about 50 million a year? Are we talking about 100 million a year? Are we talking about 200 million a year? And I think, again, these are obviously going to need to be discussions with the General Assembly if we move back, because anything that we actually are able to implement is going to require the blessing of the General Assembly, whether it's a tax fee or a toll. 81 is the only interstate corridor in the Commonwealth where no lane of interstate can be tolled without approval of the General Assembly, whether it's new or existing, whereas on other facilities we have a lot more flexibility. The other key requirement of the legislation is to develop an improvement plan, really looking at what can be financed with some of these revenue sources that we're analyzing and studying there. It really directs the board to break the corridor up into key segments where we're seeing issues and problems that need to be addressed. And then it specifically says to develop targeted improvements for this corridor. And I'll just kind of, without naming the names of certain legislators, I've had two different legislators without provocation say to me, we expect this to be something that can be implemented and advanced and really make a difference. Please do not come back to us with a study that says add one lane from Bristol all the way to Winchester and think that's what we're looking for. They really said they want to see us look at the corridor, use data, take a fresh approach, and identify some potential improvements that can be implemented within reasonable financing and revenue sources along this corridor. The legislation also specifically has a focus on operational strategies and, in particular, incident management strategies on this corridor, and I think that's a reflection of the high number of crashes, and in particular the high number of crashes that result in lane closures and multi-hour incidents. Again, 30 crashes a year take more than 6 hours to clear. I know 30 is not a high number when we're talking about crashes, but when was the last time you spent 6 hours not moving on an interstate? Because that's what that means. It's 30 different times on this corridor, several thousand people spent 6 hours not moving. So just picture that. I think we're on, hour and a half into this board meeting, and you've all been able to get up and get water and move around. Think 4 times longer, and you got what you got. There's no bathrooms, there's no more water, there's nothing. And so it's a pretty severe experience that some of our commuters face on this corridor when they see those types of incidents, and I think that's why the General Assembly really included this operational focus and also really specifically incident management. We are also supposed to really examine if truck tolling is going to be one of the recommended options moving forward. What are the potential diversionary impacts onto local roads, and are there mechanisms to reduce any potential diversion, but also reduce the impact on local trucking, either from agriculture, manufacturing, or other types of Virginia businesses. And then they do want us to look at the economic impact on, certain Virginia sectors like logistic, agriculture, and manufacturing, and whether or not any of the toll financing options have, negative or positive economic impacts on those industries. So moving forward, we've really kind of broken the plan up into 4 key elements. The first one is problem identification, which is, again, taking a look at the entire corridor, reviewing it using 3 key factors there to see where do we have severe problems that are key candidates for improvement. We're recommending to you all that we focus on 3 key items as we undertake this problem identification analysis. The first being safety, really looking at the number of crashes as well as the crash rate throughout the corridor. The second would be looking at person hours of delay. And the final one would really be, I think, getting it to the issue Mr. Fralin brought up, I think, every board meeting there towards the end about kind of the resiliency of the 81 corridor. And this is really looking at where do we have long stretches of I-81 between 2 interchanges where you may not have an accident in the same place, so we don't see it pop up in reliability, but in that 10 or 20 mile area, you might have 50 or 60 different incidents that all created some amount of lane closure or multi-hour type of delay situations where could we have pushed people off onto 11 or off onto 460 and helped them avoid that 6 hour mind-numbing experience of sitting there and not being able to move. And so, that's what we're really calling resiliency. And is this corridor able to handle and respond to significant shocks like a tractor trailer flipping over, which happens on this corridor with more frequency than any of us would like to see. We have already started to schedule public information meetings throughout this corridor on the problem identification, and I'll get into that later in the presentation. But we do hope to come back to this board in July and brief you on our initial findings there. And I do want to stress, this is identifying the problems. So again, we're looking at the severity of the problem. This is not necessarily, the worst problem may not be the most cost-effective project to implement. And so I do want to get to that later, and that's going to be later in the analysis. The next two elements, and I think we'll likely come to the board and talk about these together, is after we've identified these problems, receive feedback from the public and this body, what we'll then start to do is develop potential recommendations. And we're really taking a fresh look here at these problems and looking at ways we can address them. And I think the first thing that the commissioner and I have talked about, we're looking for this study team to do, is look at operational strategies. Where can these improvements be addressed with those types of strategies? And there's two reasons for that. Operational strategies tend to be cheaper. And if we have a dedicated revenue stream, we can really start to operate the 81 corridor in a much more effective manner. Today, the commissioner doesn't have the resources to position truck towers or truck safety service patrols throughout this corridor. But if we have a dedicated revenue stream, we can really start to operate this corridor and focus on making it work better than we're seeing today. The other thing about operational strategies is they're very quick. And so you can really start to see benefits on the ground in year one, whereas construction projects are going to take several years to move forward. So I just want to stress that is going to be the top focus. However, operational strategies are not going to solve all the problems on this corridor. And so then we will be taking a look to develop these targeted types of capacity improvements that can really address some of the other remaining issues on this corridor. That's going to be truck climbing lanes. You will see probably certain targeted widenings. Again, you're not going to see a recommendation to widen 325 miles or even 150 miles of I-81. And I expect to see a lot of interchange upgrades to address weaving and other types of issues where we see crashes taking places or other unsafe weaving that could be addressed here. As a part of this, we're also going to be looking at our tolling and financing analysis to make sure that the recommendations we're developing to get a sense for what those cost. And again, start to compare that to what is the potential amount of revenue that might be available to address some of these improvements moving forward. It's also going to be in this stage that we'll do the review of any potential impacts on Virginia agriculture, manufacturing, or logistics sectors as is required by the legislation. This is going to take us some time. We do hope to go back out to the public in August on these to get some feedback, and then we would come to see you all in September to really start to walk you through some of these potential recommendations as well as the revenue generation analysis. The final element, and I think, ultimately, as with all things, just like Smart Scale, and as we really get down to it, is what are we recommending to move forward? So really in September, we'll be looking for feedback from you all and others about what type of, financing options seem reasonable to move forward with. And then we'll come back to you in October with potential packages of recommendations that could be advanced and to get your feedback on. Again, in each of these packages, you're going to see a set of operational improvements that would be funded off the top, because we think that is important in any of these strategies. And then you'll see different amounts of remaining revenues that could be used to advance capital projects. We will be prioritizing the potential recommendations using the Smart Scale process. So again, they will be using the Smart Scale metrics, but we won't be comparing them to projects across the state. We'll really only be comparing I-81 projects to I-81, which I think will really tell us what are the most meaningful types of improvements to make along that corridor. And we'll bring, 1 to 3 different types of packages to you to get feedback. And based on that feedback, we'll come back to you in November, December with a final recommended plan for your consideration and adoption. Should you act in the affirmative, that will serve as the basis for what we'll bring to the Assembly by no later than the first day of session in 2019, as required by law. So we are going to be doing public hearings throughout the quarter, as I noted. We're currently planning on 3 sets of hearings. We're looking at doing them in 4 different locations throughout the corridor. One here in the Bristol district, another in the Salem district, and because Mr. Whitworth is just so engaged, 2 in the Stanton district. They actually have half the distance of I-81. And so that's why we're doing 2 meetings in there. Stanton is pretty far away from Winchester. And so we'll be looking at doing one in the Winchester area and another down in the Stanton area. We're also looking at partnering with the planning district commissions and the metropolitan planning areas to have them help co-host many of these meetings to ensure that the local elected officials are engaged in this process and have the opportunity to provide meaningful feedback along the way as we identify problems to make sure we haven't missed something or that we didn't look at it the right way so that we can address that early in this process rather than getting to the end of the line and getting feedback that we've missed something. The first set of meetings are already scheduled. We'll actually be where our public hearing last night was at the Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center. In 3 weeks, on June 6th, we will have our first meeting. We'll then have 3 more meetings after that in the next week and a half. And again, we'll be bringing that feedback back to the board when we see you in June. So again, moving forward, I already kind of walked you through this, but these are our next steps. And Madam Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions the board may have.
Thank you very much. Any comments, questions? Mr. Whitworth.
In anticipation of these public meetings, I notice what we are supposedly looking for is problem identification and recommendation of development and tolling. Are we going to give the public our study so far, or are we going to look for free? What is it that the public is going to hear when they walk into that meeting, and what do we actually expect to hear back?
Madam Chair, Mr. Whitworth, when the public walks into the meeting on June 6th at the Higher Education Center, 35 miles down the road, what they are going to see is the first cut on the problem identification using those 3 items I laid out there. Staff started working on this once the bill passed the first chamber during session, so we kind of got a head start, hoping that the bill would clear both chambers, as it ultimately did. And so they are going to see detailed information of their portion of I-81, as well as some other information about the rest of 81, identifying where these problem areas are from a safety perspective, from a congestion perspective, and from a resiliency perspective. What we're looking for in those meetings are there things they think our data missed? Or are there things that they think our data has wrong, or do they have other areas that they think that we need to consider and kind of reasons why, so that we can take that back and, modify our evaluation and analysis as appropriate?
Will they be able to see that information in advance of the meeting?
Madam Chair, Mr. Whitworth, I think the meeting is probably where that would first roll out, but let me talk with the study team and see if there aren't mechanisms by which we can get that out to the PDC and MPO staff in advance of that meeting.
It would seem to me that there's a lot of information that will be coming out.
Sure.
It would seem to me that it would make sense to give a little bit of advance time to have reflection and interaction among the various constituencies that would have interest in that information.
Madam Chair, Mr. Whitworth, I will talk with Ben Manel, who's leading the study. He's back there. Hopefully he's waving right now since I said his name. And we'll see if we can't get that information out at least a week, if not 2 in advance. I do want to note, I think 2 may not be achievable, but we will do our absolute best to get that out in advance to folks.
I wonder if we could create an 81 study page on the CTB website, since it's coming through us, where you could be updated, people would know where the meetings are, you could, you let them know what we're going to be focusing on at, the issues at each of the meetings. You are right, Mr. Whitworth, there's a lot of information already out there. I think trying to prioritize it is going to be important, and to identify a funding sources for this. That's what really separates this study from everything else that we have done, is looking for ways, if we could dedicate funding to the 81 corridor for many of these priorities, it would open up much of the money that already invested from Bristol, Stanton, and Salem going to the corridor. That money could be invested in other transportation priorities.
So $180 million from Smart Scale put in the 81 corridor in round 1 and 2.
And that would go back to your districts. And so finding a way to do this. I have a question in that part of this is making sure we're meeting with all stakeholders, manufacturing, trucking industry, and so how do you plan to incorporate that?
We've already started reaching out directly to the manufacturers and truckers. In fact, next week in Dublin, Virginia, I'll be on the agenda speaking at the Virginia Manufacturers Association. The Virginia Trucking Association President Dale Bennett, as well as Brett Vassley, the president of the Virginia Manufacturing Association, are both going to be present, along with the Delegate Yancey, the chair of the Transportation Committee, and several other legislators. And so I expect we're going to have a robust dialogue regarding some of the concerns and things that they'd like to see addressed in this study. And again, we welcome their feedback. I think everyone agrees 81 needs to be improved, and hopefully we can find consensus on some ways to do that.
If we do this right and it's done well, the greatest beneficiaries will be the trucking industry and manufacturers. So that's how we want to go into this. That's what I really believe is going to happen. Also, the business community has reached out, and so making sure we coordinate with them as well, beyond manufacturing, who very much want to have a say in this. So
Yes, no, several of the chambers were present at the Stanton public hearing, and I believe we're going to be reaching out to them in advance of those meetings and making sure they're aware of when they're scheduled.
Mr. Yates.
Question, a little conversation about this already. I'm just curious, is there nowhere else in the United States where trucks only are tolled now? Is that
There is one other state that is moving forward with this concept. They are much further along. I believe they're getting ready to turn on their toll gantries any week now, and that is the state of Rhode Island. They have a program called Rhode Island Works that has several different components. One of them, though, is charging trucks only, I believe on
federal road?
Oh, Madam Chair, Mr. Yates, I should have said this earlier in the presentation. We have met with the United States Department of Transportation and discussed this study and some of the concepts that we're directed to look at, and there are multiple mechanisms by which we could implement a truck-only toll. So some of the things you may see us consider as we look at this is, do you want to charge one toll rate during the day and a lower toll rate at night to encourage trucks to use the roadway in the evening hours when less commuters are on there, there's more capacity, and is that a way to also kind of rebalance traffic in a way that might reduce the needed capital improvements, which in turn can reduce the potential toll rate and provide benefits to in a lot of ways?
Mr. Yates, there are other states looking at this time. Anything else? All right, Mr. Donahue, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manel.